Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar, from the 8th webinar from the Cyberwatching project. Welcome to our speakers and also welcome to all of our participants. Many of you, I think, maybe have attended the other webinars that our project has organized. So today's webinar is organized together with the PANACEA project and the Canvas project as well. So we'll have different speakers from all three projects. So today's topic is cybersecurity for healthcare, and today we're going to be looking at both human and legal perspectives. So as you know, the digital era is bringing new opportunities, better care and more efficiency for healthcare organizations and also for patients alike. But at the same time, it introduces new challenges and including greater risks. So this is an issue which is really a big problem for many healthcare professionals and also for healthcare organizations. Cybersecurity attacks and incidents are more costly than in other domains, and they cost billions of euros a year, causing not just money challenges, but also challenges to patients, causing severe disruption, and patient safety is put at risk. We all know about the WannaCry cyber attack in 2017. This affected the National Health Service in the UK, and thousands of computers were hijacked, and we saw the effects this had on professionals, but also patients alike. Another challenge is the technologies that hospitals have. This varies in terms of how new they are, even from the infrastructure in hospitals to medical devices, and there are real problems and security gaps, such as pacemakers, which can be easily hacked. Human error as well is also a challenge which needs to be addressed, especially with the introduction of new EU legislation, such as the GDPR, which looks to address and protect the rights of European citizens. So what can healthcare institutions and healthcare professionals do about this, and how prepared are they at the moment to address these risks? Just how sensitive is the data, is health data, and how different is it from normal data? And what are the implications of GDPR on this? So to answer these points and many other points and many other questions that you may have, we're very pleased to have 4 speakers, 3 of which are women, which we're very pleased about. So from a healthcare perspective, we have Sabina Magalini from the Polytechnic University Gemelli in Rome and the PANACEA project. We have Raniero Rapone from Aon and the Cyberwatching project, who will look at how cybersecurity can be managed in healthcare organizations. We're also very lucky to have 2 legal and GDPR perspectives. Firstly, from Anastasia Bozzi from ICT Legal, who will be looking at giving an overview of the GDPR and its implications for the healthcare system. And then finally, we'll have a perspective from Eva Schlellen, who's from the Independent Center of Privacy and Protection in Germany and the Canvas project, who are just coming to a close, and they have actually provided a framework to address EU data protection law and risk assessment in a number of sectors, including the health sector. And finally, there'll be 15 minutes at the end for your questions, and you can put your questions in the chat box in the GoToWebinar control panel that you should be able to see on your screens. So we can see today we've had 70 registrants for the webinar, which is extremely pleasing. And we have a large number of SMEs represented as well, which shows the interest, I think, in this topic, especially given as we are from an R&I project. So of course we have people from academia and research on the webinar, but I think that the mix of people who have joined us today and will be joining us really shows the interest and also the strength of EC funded projects in bringing various stakeholders together. So just a final word on the project. As I said, this is the 8th webinar that we have organized as the Cyberwatching project. There's some final slides here that you could take a look at, please. Our project looks to bring together various stakeholders in cybersecurity and privacy, bring them together to collaborate and bring them together to take forward and address the various challenges that come up in sectors like the healthcare sector. Okay, so with that, I will hand over to our first speaker. So Sabina, the floor is yours and your perspective from the healthcare sector.
Hello. Good morning. Good morning. My name is Sabina Magalini, and I am an emergency surgeon. I work in the Fondazione Policlinico Gemelli, and our group has been interested in medical security for a long time. I want to present the PANACEA projects and cybersecurity from a healthcare professional's perspective, meaning doctors, nurses, and the people who work inside the hospital. How do I go on with the slide? Can you give me the second slide, please?
Just click on it, Sabina.
Okay. As I was telling you, I'm an emergency surgeon, and I deal every day with critically ill patients who require immediate diagnostics and sometimes surgery. If you ask me what is my worst nightmare today, after a massive shooting or a major incident, I say a distributed cyber attack. Example, my patient has just come in from an accident. She needs an urgent CT exam. I can't access the radiology system because they tell me it's blocked. These are examples of what comes up on your screen when you have a cyber attack in a hospital of this kind. Despite this, we wheel her to the radiology suite. It's impossible to register because the machine won't work due to the fact that she has not been registered. This is a problem on the radiology machines all over in every hospital. So we find help, unblock the system, go back to the manual mode, waste time, and the patient's conditions are worsening. Finally, we get to the operating room. There's no possibility of getting compatibility for blood and many other unthinkable denials of service. It's like going back to the 19th century. I want to explain why cyber attacks in the healthcare system and hospitals are different from those taking place in other contexts. Hospitals at the moment just can't handle cybersecurity threats. They're not ready. Healthcare operations nowadays are increasingly based and dependent from information systems. All the devices we have used in the hospital, such as ECG monitors, radiology machines, infusion pumps, were designed when cybersecurity was not an everyday issue. These devices are the hospital assets. They're the hospital's richness, but they represent for us black boxes because we don't know how they were built and where and how they can be attacked. And it would be very costly to dismiss them. At the same time, we are dealing with a plethora of new connected devices, such as wearable monitors and new drug infusion pumps. Hospitals are like seaports, as you know. Anyone can come and go. There is a constant appearance of new threats, one for all, new, creative, and menacing. An Israeli group has found a way to add a tumor directly on the radiography exam, to misdiagnose high-level personalities and have them go under unnecessary surgery. Who could ever thought of that? How can we deal with all these issues? Hospital administrations have been focusing up till now mainly on the protection of patient data, whose leakage has been considered the worst-case scenario, even because it can be fined according to country legislations. Hospitals are correctly worried about the cybersecurity of patient data. This security is not guaranteed now 100%. We know that electronic health records can be found on the dark web for very low prices. Some say for $350 to $800, according to the information available. I just want to explain why patient health information is more valuable than personally identifiable information, which, by the way, is available on the dark web at the value of $1 to $2 apiece. Personally identifiable information is, for example, the information on who you are, your social security number or fiscal code, your credit card number. This information is valuable, but it is changeable. So once the threat or the misuse is identified, it can be changed. Patient health information is forever. Instead, why is this data so valuable? The short answer is simple. One of the primary ways of accessing additional information required to steal identity is by securing an individual's medical and health records. These contain, in addition to a person's medical history, a lot of sensitive information, such as an individual identifying characteristics, their date of birth and their parents' names and date of birth. It also contains information that can usually be used to answer security questions or apply for other identity documents, such as birth certificates. Stolen medical records are used for many types of identity threats, such as healthcare frauds, filing fraudulent tax returns, and opening new lines of credit. The bazaar of healthcare data also help pharma industry to sell more drugs through targeting of doctors according to the drugs they prescribe. Big data in healthcare are continuously mined by IBM and other major software companies with the intention of consenting medical breakthroughs that at the moment we have not yet seen. Another point to be considered is that these kind of cyber attacks are not immediately identified. Recent data show that most of them, in fact, are uncovered after they have been active inside hospital structures for a median of 18 months. So let's look at the main types of cyber threats daily experienced in hospitals. A number for all, data breaches, as we were saying. Over 50 million records have been compromised by data breaches only last year. Ransomware. Ransomware is the most frequent cyber threat, including in this also the malware, which we have seen in the previous example, can have even worse consequences, because with tampering with data, you can do anything. Ransomware may happen through phishing with dangerous attachments, clicking on malicious links, sometimes also simply looking at an advertisement. The last but not least threat we're having is the ongoing diffusion of ransomware as a service. This system allows any one of us to perform a ransomware attack where we want, hospitals included. And if we have success, the provider of the software will ask for a 50% of the revenue. Unthinkable, right? Distributed denial of services is the most feared. And while we can face a simple denial of service, for example, for a selected sector of our activity, through some kind of redundancy of the ICT system of the hospital, the distributed denial of services is ominous. This kind of attack has sometimes been perpetrated also for ideological reasons of anger against healthcare structures, choosing one type of patient management instead of another. A famous example happened in Boston in 2014, where a hacker group that knew the parents of this child damaged a hospital setting because the hospital had chosen to apply one therapy instead of another to the child in disagreement with her parents. So one thing that healthcare operators must keep in mind is that medical operations may create conditions of anger and revenge and condition the occurrence of what today we're calling hybrid threats. In healthcare settings, due to the complexity of many overlapping information systems utilized, insider threats are common, as recognized also by the Journal of the American Medical Associations. In fact, only insiders have legitimate access to the system, so they can skip the cybersecurity defenses. Incredibly, the best defense against these kind of threats is by other insiders that usually perceive there is something going wrong. Last but not least in frequency is the compromise of business emails, with the intent of fraud. Scammers pretend to be a person of power, typically in the hospital, the CEO or the supervisor, like the chief of the nursing ward, and they ask the victim to pay for some service on their behalf because they have the credentials to do it. These kind of threats in hospital have risen 1,300% since 2015. As healthcare workers, some of these threats we know, others we ignore because often they are not made public. Very little help was coming from the administration and governance of the hospital. Hospital ICT personnel is insufficient to address all these threats. We also have scarce knowledge of the ICT system that is working inside our hospitals, and also of the devices we utilize. The present methods to guarantee cybersecurity in our systems are very time-consuming. Nurses, technicians, and doctors must daily identify on different terminals and devices much more often than employees working in other industries or roles. From memory, I tell you some data. An average person logs in and off, often not, because the logging off is not done often, around 27 times a day. Healthcare operators during a shift log in and onto the system over 80 times a day. And this reportedly has led to burnout and especially of the adoption of simplified workaround behaviors that pose the system even more at risk, like leaving the log on the system. The PANACEA project considers not only the technical aspects of the healthcare security, but also the human and the staff-related issues. PANACEA aims at involving healthcare staff together with the ICT hospital staff and technical partners to identify the cyber risks, work methodology possible, and possibly the tailored solutions. This is an illustration of the solution toolkit of PANACEA. Here we can see that together with the technical solutions shown in the points 1, 2, 3, and 4, PANACEA develops, according to its caption phrase, people-centric cybersecurity in healthcare, also 3 solutions acting on the human factors. I want to conclude showing the partners of the project, and I hope to come back to you soon with some possible solutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabina. That was extremely interesting, and it just shows the importance of having, you know, an expert in the field that the cybersecurity solutions are trying to reach out to be involved in not only the PANACEA project but also this webinar. So it's very interesting to hear your various perspectives on the challenges and the risks that, you know, the logging in issue that, you know, 80 times a day, and it can put doctors off, I'm sure. So in response to that, we now have our next presentation, which is from Raniero Rapone from Aon. Now, Raniero is both in the Cyberwatching project, but also is part of the PANACEA project. So Raniero, we pass the floor to you for your perspective on how cybersecurity can be managed in healthcare organizations. Over to you.
Thank you. I'm Raniero Rapone from Aon and I'm focused on the risk evaluation in appropriate consultant company of the Aon groups. And in this presentation, I will give an overview of the governance, the cybersecurity governance, especially in the healthcare domain. Starting to understanding what is the meaning of the cybersecurity governance, 5 questions must be considered. The first is, okay, I need to identify which resources, IT resources, I need to protect. That are important, as the previous presentation said, are important for the processes, but not also for that, because contain information and so forth. And then I have to understand how I can protect this kind of resources, which kind of system I have, which kind of policies, and so forth. And another most important things is, okay, but I also find a way to understand if my context and my resources are under attack, and then how I can immediately respond. Or if I have compromised the resources, how I can restore these immediately, and so rehab the process ongoing. In general, this is actually is defined. The cybersecurity governance model is also defined as information security management system from the modern model like NIST national framework, ISO 27, and so forth in the order. This model is based in conceptual area that I described. So identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And on this macro area has been defined in several categories that have single objects to achieve in order to map this area and understand the content of the conceptual. To do that, you need to have some controls to be implemented able to achieve these objects for each category. That means, for example, I have to control the access to the device, how I'm able to map who manage the information, and so forth. So there are more specific category with single objectives of the governance in general that helps to understand which kind of control systems that I have to implement in order to better govern the security. How we are doing that in PANACEA? The first things that we are doing is select the best controls for healthcare, also keeping in mind what the main model actually present in the research, like the NIST model or the ISO 27 standards can suggest us. But because in healthcare there are also other aspects that are not considering very well from this kind of the guidelines or standards, in PANACEA we are trying to understand how to improve the control to use in order to bind them also to all other standards. They are more specific for the healthcare domain. For example, how we have to map control that's considering the cybersecurity to the medical device, as Sabrina said. This kind of products are black box in their context, but are really important from cybersecurity point of view. So we have to define, or also in PANACEA research, we are trying to understand if we can put in place, let's say, some rules in order to interact with the vendor of these devices in order to create a list of security constraints for new products, for example. So it means that the control that we are going to select will be related to standards that are not just the actual standard, but also other standards that are more specific in healthcare domain. What we are going to have in terms of outcomes from these tools that is inside of a PANACEA framework that's more wide in terms of what we want to perform. The tools for the cybersecurity governance wants to have an overview of the security governance in terms of the area status and gaps, obviously, but also more in deep in the categories that we want to analyze. and then have a prioritization according to the best standards in order to suggest to the rest of the PANACEA or interact with the rest of the PANACEA framework with the other tools, because in PANACEA framework, for example, as Sabrina said, we have a dynamic risk modeling that understand which is the level of the risks for this process or the other process, and then this is an input to understand which kind of the controls we have to be in place, or we have to evaluate in order to give the feedback to the risk modeling, and so also to understand the countermeasure to have to deploy. For example, a training to the operator about the phishing campaign, how these are being performed, or how to defend this kind of the systems using the segregation, in order how to manage the data, and which kind of data, sensible data, must be selected, or who read what, and so forth. So in this way, the tools inside of the PANACEA framework that we are doing, or we are implementing, have the main goal to interact with the other tools of the framework in order to provide a list of the recommendations, but also in terms of the policies, but also in terms of the systems to deploy, or modification in topology, network topology, and so forth. This is in very short presentation. It's what we are doing as a governance tool inside of the framework that have a lot of interact with the other role, because in healthcare it's not just a device problem, it's also a human manage a lot of information. Protected information, protected process are at the same level in several conditions. And so what we want to perform is define how to have a view of this status in order to better define with the best results the policies, but also the systems and the countermeasure that the tools can provide, in general speaking. So I'm really complete this short presentation, and if you have questions, I'll try to respond quickly and detailed as possible. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Raniero. That's very interesting. Please put them in the chat, and we'll deal with them as we go on.
Okay.
I'm not sure if everyone heard me there, but if you'd like to add your questions into the chat box, then please do. Okay, so we'll move on to the next presentation, which looks at the data protection issue. So we mentioned this, and Sabina mentioned this as being one of the priorities for hospitals. So we're going to have two next presentations on legal issues. The first is from Anastasia Bozzi from ICT Legal and the Cyberwatching project. This presentation looks really at how to build good GDPR protection and how to be compliant with it. So Anastasia, over to you.
Thank you for the introduction, Nicolas. As Nick very quickly mentioned, on behalf of ICT Legal Consulting, I will present a small guide as to how to build a solid GDPR or data protection compliance framework, with highly focusing on the healthcare sector and the principles and obligations that are mostly relevant for this sector. Our firm has offices in Italy and in the Netherlands. And as a matter of fact, we specialize on privacy, data protection, and all other legal aspects of information and communication and technology. So our team, Professor Dr. Paolo Balboni, who, as a matter of fact, unfortunately could not attend today and present instead of me, Avvocato Laura Segnatore, who's also a partner in our firm, and myself, Anastasia Bozzi, as an associate. But before we jump into the obligations, it's important to have a good understanding and base ground of what are we talking about? What are the definitions that the GDPR concerns itself with? And the first one is, of course, personal data. Personal data is many times mistaken as just a name or contact details, but as a matter of fact, it includes all information relating to an identified or an identifiable natural person. And by identifiable, that means that any characteristic that can be directly or indirectly linked to that individual. So that is a broader definition than sometimes thought of. Then we have the two roles of the
Anastasia,
yes?
Sorry to interrupt you. Can you switch screen? I think we are not seeing your slides changing.
One moment. It shows just a blank. Okay, one moment. I will stop my screen and then we start showing it again.
Yeah.
All right, what about now?
Yeah, good, perfect.
All right,
thank you, Anastasia.
Okay. Apologies for that. So when we look at the two roles that are involved in the processing, we have on the one side the data controller, which is the company or organization that determines the reason and the means of the processing, and the data processor, which is the company that processes on behalf of the controller according to their instructions. So that could be the systems that are used, the providers that are used to process the data, the health data. And processing, similarly to personal data, is many times mistaken. And in the GDPR, it has also very broad scope, including essentially any operation or set of operations, such as collection, recording, consultation, and also mere storage. So when we look at specifically the health sector, a definition that is especially important is, of course, the special categories of personal data definition, which includes data concerning health, which is a physical or mental health characteristics relating to a natural person, genetic data, and biometric data, which are quite self-explanatory. Now, the GDPR has two objectives, essentially. The first is to protect the individual's personal data, and the second is to ensure the free movement of that personal data. So it's not only about protection, it's also about ensuring that the movement of the personal data, which in our days is inherent in our lives, will happen in a protected manner. When we look at the GDPR, we see that there is two components that have been substantially strengthened in comparison to the previous legislation, and that is the accountability principle and the security measures that are expected, as also covered in the previous presentations. ICT Legal Consulting has created a simplified approach to data protection through a compliance framework, which you can see here is a circular motion starting from accountability and moving throughout the different principles that are expected. We will shortly now go into an explanation of most of these principles that will offer some insight as to what accountability means. So under the GDPR, what is stated is that essentially it is the responsibility of the data controller to ensure and to be able to demonstrate that the organization is compliant with the GDPR. And what this means is that the organization must implement appropriate technical and organizational measures in order to be able to demonstrate to the outer world that they are compliant. When we look at the security measures, essentially what is the core of this concept in the GDPR is the risk-based approach in security. And what this means is that an organization is expected to first assess the risks of the processing activities that they are conducting, and after that, subsequently decide on the security and organizational measures that are relevant to the level of the risk of the processing. So in most cases in the healthcare sector, we see that the risk is quite high, because as previously mentioned, we're talking about serious health situations of people in our society. So this is considered one of the highest risks for humans. And simply listing a couple of examples of what security and organizational measures may be in this sector, it could be, for example, physical and technical separation of the personal data and the encrypted data. It could be the respect of access right protocols, meaning that there should not be any sharing of credentials. Another example can be the sharing of health data in a secure form, such as encryption, and of course, following and respecting your confidentiality obligations as employees to a healthcare organization or a clinic. Other than that, of course, there is a well-known data breach challenge in the GDPR, which obliges that organizations must communicate to the relevant supervisory authorities within 72 hours from when becoming aware of an incident. And as previously mentioned, these incidents are not always as apparent. So here, the point that is important is that communication is key. There should always be a small policy or a procedure that employees or staff of a hospital or clinic can follow. And basically, that's just a good understanding of who should be contacted when there is an incident or when there is a suspicion of an incident, and what information should be required by the employees or by the IT and administration. Another important principle in this sphere is the principle of transparency. And what this entails is that when personal data are collected from a patient, there needs to be some minimal information that is given to them in consideration of what is going to happen with their data. And you can find a short list here in this template, or you can also take a look at Articles 13 and 14 of the GDPR. An important component of the information that must be provided to the data subject is the information regarding their rights and how to freely exercise them. The GDPR strongly focuses on this. It has a long section specifically dedicated to the rights of the data subject. So every employee must be familiar with these rights and offer them as in an easy form to their patients. Of course, we cannot speak of the GDPR without mentioning the principle of lawfulness, which in the health sector takes a different form as well, seeing as the GDPR states that in order to process personal data, you must have the correct legal basis chosen. So for regular personal data, that includes the performance of a contract, consent, legal obligation, which is only when a regulation is applicable to your organization, a legitimate interest of the organization, vital interests, and the public interest. But when we look at the special categories of personal data, which is what health data would mostly fall under, we see even further obligations on this principle. We find the explicit consent, which has a higher threshold of consent. It must be clearly distinguishable, very easy to access, and given in a clear form, so it cannot be misunderstood. We see the vital interest of the data subject, which is in cases of life or death situations, for example, emergency in the emergency department or in the emergency surgeries, where the person is incapable of giving their consent. So a hospital could rely on that legal basis. We find preventative or occupational medicine legal basis, which essentially is only for medical diagnosis and other provision of health, social care treatments. And then the last and most extreme is the public interest in the area of public health, which concerns cross-border threats to health and covers very higher standards and epidemics that concern several European member states. Further, we have the principle of purpose limitation, which covers the idea that you should only collect personal data for a specific and explicit purpose, meaning that you cannot just reuse that data in ways that have not already been explained to the data subject. If that is the case, then you need to conduct a compatibility test according to the components that we've linked here, and then possibly you may need to get further consent from the data subject or rely on the legal basis that you chose initially. Lastly, we have the principle of data minimization, which is very simple, essentially that the data that is collected needs to be adequate, relevant, and limited to what is necessary in relation to the purposes which have been chosen. So an organization should not mindlessly process personal data and collect personal data that may not be needed. We should try to keep it to what is strictly necessary for providing a health or medical diagnosis. And actually, something that was mentioned earlier as well is that member states here can have the leeway to introduce further conditions. So depending on the country that you're operating in, it would be important to make sure that you take a look into the national law as well, since this is a highly regulated national matter. Additionally, the Council of Europe has given some recommendations to organizations for the protection of health-related data that can be an interesting tool other than the GDPR. And now looking at the implementation of the GDPR, I'm sure most of you have heard that the fines can be quite great. The worst case scenario can be in case of violation of data subject rights, or in violation of the basic principles that we just mentioned, which would be fined by a maximum of 4% of an undertaking's total annual turnover, or 20 million, depending on what is greater. And apart from this, the data subjects also have the right to remedies. For example, they can lodge a complaint about your organization to the supervisory authority, which would lead to an investigation. They could start legal action or even class actions, as we have seen are actually pending at the moment around Europe. And now just a very, very quick outlook into what we have already seen in the GDPR. In Portugal, a couple of months ago, an investigation was conducted on Hospital do Barreiro, where they found out that over 980 doctors, psychologists, and staff of the hospital could freely access patient data without having actually the authorization to do so. So this lack of internal policies for access rights and the failure to remove the access rights of terminated employees, meaning that doctors that had left the hospital could still access patient rights, led to a fine of 400,000 euro for that hospital, which was broken down into several reasons due to the breach of these principles. And then secondly, we have another case in the Netherlands, which fined the Haga hospital, where dozens of hospital staff could unnecessarily check the medical records of a famous person, a Dutch person. And the Data Protection Authority said that the insufficient security measures were in two areas. Firstly, we have the obligation of a hospital to regularly check who consults the patient records. And secondly, we have the consideration that a good security requires authentication with at least two factors, for example, a password and a staff pass or something similar. And seeing as none of these existed in this case, the hospital was also fined with 460 euro, and simultaneously they were imposed of an order which was also subject to penalty, meaning that if the hospital did not improve their security within a couple of months after the investigation and the decision, then the hospital would pay an extra 100,000 euro every 2 weeks. So as we see, the supervisory authorities are taking these matters very seriously, and it is extremely relevant to be aware of what is expected and how to tackle these cases. If you would like to stay updated on any further legislation or opinions that come up, please feel free to sign up to our newsletter. And thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to receiving your questions.
Thank you very much, Anastasia. It was very interesting, and very interesting to see the types of fines that hospitals are now getting, and also the added difference between laws between different countries as well, which is something to bear in mind. So we've got a couple of questions that have come in for you, which we'll look at the end after Eva's presentation. So Eva, your
yeah, hello. So
presentation.
So do you see something?
Over to you.
Yes.
Okay, great. So hello everybody. My name is Eva Schlehan, and as introduced before, I'm a senior legal researcher and consultant at the Independent Center for Privacy Protection, which is a data protection supervisory authority in the northernmost federal states of Germany. And yeah, today I'm going to take a little bit of a more high-level viewpoint on the GDPR and risk assessment in the health sector. My work is basically based on the Canvas project, which is a coordination and support action and informing stakeholders how cybersecurity can be aligned with European values and fundamental rights. Okay, so let's get started. Cybersecurity and data protection both matter in the healthcare sector. Earlier before, we had heard in the several presentations of certain cybersecurity incidents like hacking, ransomware, hospitals taking weeks before their IT systems are functioning again properly. Also of data leaks and also data leaks at third-party vendors. So you had a whole range of different cybersecurity incidents. But there's also a recognition that not just the outside hackers are responsible for cybersecurity incidents. For example, there had already in 2014 there had been a study to examine the reasons of incidents in cybersecurity and in the health sector. And I just want to show you one excerpt of the study, which is basically the conclusion that most incidents and data breaches appear to be the result of theft and loss, not hacking or IT incidents. So in general, the core reason of cybersecurity incidents is poor baseline security. So missing encryption, lack of access control, we've heard that before. And so there's a lot of things to do actually. So what does this have to do with data protection, and what's the relation to IT security and cybersecurity? So basically the viewpoint is a different one. In security, you have the assumption that any person can be an attacker. From data protection view, we have a fundamental rights perspective. So the right to privacy and the right to data protection are fundamental rights, and so data protection law is basically addressing power asymmetries between persons and organizations. So here I've written down on this slide for cryptologists, especially Bob would be the attacker, not Eve or Mallory. The controller obligations were mentioned before by Ms. Botzi, and so you have the technical and organizational measures, the obligation to demonstrate compliance, and so forth. However, I'm going to focus only on one thing for now because we only have that 10 minutes. I'm focusing on the data protection impact assessment and the risk, the identification of risk in data protection from that perspective. The data protection impact assessment is manifested in Article 35 of the General Data Protection Regulation, and you have to, as a data controller, to conduct such an impact assessment the moment processing is likely to result in a high risk to the rights and freedoms of natural persons. So the question is, when does that actually happen? And the Article 29 Working Party, which is now the European Data Protection Board since the reform of the European Data Protection Law, had determined 9 criteria which play a role to determine whether a high risk is given. So you have a processing operation, and you have to look at whether evaluation or scoring is involved, automatic decision making, and so forth, systematic monitoring. And in the healthcare sector, especially 2 of them play a role, which is not exclusively, because it's always context dependent and dependent on the case. So, for example, in scientific research in the health sector, you could also have, for example, data processors that allow scale matching or combining data sets and so forth. So, but sensitive data, so special categories of personal data and data concerning vulnerable data subjects play the main role in that sector. So these 9 criteria help in addressing the question, do I really need to conduct a data protection impact assessment? And then I need to address risk. So what is risk from data protection perspective? Actually, since we have a fundamental right, which is the right to data protection, once a processing operation occurs, you actually have a risk that has been occurred, even if the processing is covered by a legal ground and you use verifiably secure IT. So with the data protection impact assessment, you have the task of reducing the further risk as far as possible for the data subject. And that risk assessment is also meant to determine the needed necessary, that's double, technical and organizational measures that you need to implement to achieve that goal. So risk from data protection view, what's that? Here I have written down a definition. So you have an event that is in itself a damage or can lead to further damage to one or more individuals. That damage can be physical, material, or immaterial. Because of that interference with fundamental rights. I go back 2 slides to Article 35. You have high risk to the rights and freedoms of natural persons. So that could be any kind of fundamental rights, for example, the right to, not to get discriminated. So that could also be an immaterial damage resulting from, for example, a data leak. Okay, you have different steps of a risk assessment, which is not so very far from the classical security risk assessment. First, you have to identify the risks, what damages can occur, what events may lead to damage, and which actions or factors can lead to events. So you have to have a kind of an attacker model and to check, okay, what could happen, and in identifying these risks, you also have to look at the data itself, at the systems you use, and the processes you use. So it's three different aspects that you need to take care of. In the second step, you assess the risk in terms of gravity of potential damage that could occur and the likelihood of that if that could happen. And the third thing would be a categorization of risks that can help to determine the measures. Here's a visualization of such a risk assessment for determining, okay, how serious is it actually in terms of the gravity of the potential damage or the likelihood of occurrence. It's very hard To quantify that exactly, most likely it will be that you approximate it just as you think it could be. It's very hard to foresee to what extent the damage can impact financially, materially, or physically, or even as immaterial damage. Okay, some high-level typical risks in data protection. The first would be you have illegitimate personal data processing operation. So you do not have a legal ground. The second risk would be there are some fundamental flaws in assessment of the fundamental rights infringement, or the legal ground was not sufficiently identified. You have picked the wrong one, or the assumption of accountability is unclear. So it's unclear who is the controller, who's the processor, and so forth. The third risk would be the extension or changing of processing purpose. That you have that very often in the context of data retention and big data. And fourth risk would be a failure to implement sufficiently effective measures for IT security. And the fifth risk sounds similar, like the fourth, but it's a little bit different because you have IT security measures, but not in conformity with fundamental rights. So you have the classic clash of security and data protection. One example would be in security, you have a very strong obligation to keep data confidential, but if you apply that rule too strictly, you restrict the data subject's right of access, for example. So that would be a classical example of that. Okay, the sixth risk is the attacker model is incorrect or complex, and the last one is the processing operation is not sufficiently audited and evaluated. How to use synergies between IT security and data protection. From Mr. Rapapone, early on, we had a very interesting concept to do an IT security management to apply such a concept. What is also known in IT security are protection goals that you can work with as objectives to apply to your data systems and processes to see, okay, what do I need to do in terms of confidentiality? What do I need to do in terms of integrity of the data? What do I need to do in terms of availability of the data systems and processes? My suggestion would be use this operative solution and complement it with the standard data protection model, which is a model developed by the German DPAs. And it extends the classic IT security goals by three complementing goals that come from data protection perspective, which is unlinkability, transparency, and intervenability. So these three address the data protection perspective in particular. So you have unlinkability, so not to link data, and to have the data minimization principle embedded in your processing operation. You have transparency, so that the data subject knows what's going on, and you have intervenability. So if something goes awry, the data subject can intervene, but also the controller can intervene and have control over the own processing operation. So this standard data protection model is one of the PPIA frameworks that have been mentioned by the Article 29 Working Party, and so it is a well recognized model, and so that would be my suggestion. Okay, for further information, since my time is basically over, we in Canvas have produced more information and learning material, not just about data protection perspective on cybersecurity, but we have interdisciplinary work produced from ethical, legal, and technical viewpoints, and in these white papers, and we have briefing packages for policymakers in Europe, and we also addressing training and education with a reference curriculum and a MOOC. There's an upcoming book for November announced, I guess, which is the title is Ethics of Cybersecurity, which could also be of interest for you. So that's basically it. Since I'm assuming that the slides will be made available afterwards to the participants as well, I have also integrated the slides with the Canvas website URL and also my references. So if you want to have a closer look at the concepts and the models, you can do so with further resources. Thank you.
Eva, thank you very much. That was a very thorough presentation. Very interesting to see how the Canvas project has really taken on this issue and produced. I mean, the previous slide you have up with the training modules and the other results from the project are very, very good to see a project coming out with some assets that can be used by not just the health sector, but also by other sectors. So, thank you very much for that. So what we're going to do is we're going to stay on a few more minutes. I know we've gone past midday, but if you can bear with us, then what we'll do is we'll have some more questions. So if you have any questions, please put them in the questions or the chat box, and we'll try to get them answered. One thing I'd like to say is, so a project like Canvas, which is coming to an end, if you're interested, then you should really publish your results in the Cyberwatching Project Hub, where we've got over 150 web pages dedicated to the various R&I projects in cybersecurity. And there's a place where you can actually upload your results, such as access to the online training and the recommendations documents on there. So we're trying to help projects to get more visibility, and also to create one place where you can access the results from projects, and also then for more information go to the project websites themselves. So if we look at we had a couple of questions come in directly for certain speakers. The first question I'd like to put is actually to Raniero. So Raniero, you mentioned that that you were working with the information security management systems, and also the information security managers themselves, and you're working with them and the data protection management team and other organizations, relevant entities. So are you bringing all of those people together, and are they working together to address these issues? Raniero.
Oh yes, generally speaking, the definition of the information security management system is also is now the best definition that also the ISO 27 standards include in the HACCP way to define the object, okay, the company object to improve. Inside of this governance, data privacy protection is something that is already included in the context, and as previously has been detailed, a lot of controls that you have to define for the governance, in general speaking, include what has been described. For example, several relationship with the articles, the API, for example, or the other things must be included in general speaking in what is called now the governance. So in the organization, what is ongoing, that's starting from who have responsibility for the security and privacy. This, let's say, department of the company is growing in more general governance, because a lot of companies doesn't have this reality inside itself, or have let's say the governance of the security not completed, or just in IT, because IT do something and have a relationship with the privacy officer and so forth. So what is more detailed and also defined in these standards is considering the governance as a component of the organization that must be put near to the top management and must have a relationship with the legal office, for example, because inside of this kind of security there are aspects for the data protection. So yeah, actually when we perform this kind of the analysis, we include also
We can't hear you, Raniero. Think you have a problem with your mic?
Okay, so I think we've lost Raniero there, but it's very interesting to hear the importance of these different departments working together. So the legal department, the cybersecurity department. A question to Sabina: how hospitals are humongous places, lots of different departments. How does these conversations take place from your perspective? Are they happening? How easy is it for these things to?
On our side, I speak naturally on the operator side, doctors, nurses, technicians. Our contacts with the governance of the hospital is lacking at the moment. We have major guidelines on our behaviors.
Yeah, if you go on, Sabina.
Okay, may I go on? Oh, I'm sorry. What I was saying, naturally they enforce the security measures, but there is not so much, let's say, comprehension of what are our needs. A doctor, a nurse, and a technician wants to do his work basically, and he wants to do it quick, fast, and be efficient. Most of the security measures we have in the hospital at the moment are so cumbersome. It is so complicated that in a way we are, let's say simply, but don't laugh, we are begging someone to give us a secure system that will not waste half of the time that we employ to do the things we have to do, taking care of the security measures. This is extreme naturally, but this is really the discussion between the staff and the governance. So
thank you, Sabine. I can understand the frustration as well. You're trying to do your job and you're blocked or you're slowed down. I wondered. I had a question for both Anastasia and Eva. So I wanted to know from the other side your experience of working with the health sector. If you've had experience in that from an outsider perspective, working with a hospital, for example, how easy is it? How easy is it for this to happen too?
Well, at least from my perspective, my experience is that the teams working on data protection and security issues are mostly very understaffed and underfunded. And so it's very difficult for them to address all the issues comprehensively. So that's actually the main issue I see at the moment. Because if they would have a lot more resources, that would be way easier for them to really get organized in terms of, okay, to conduct a very comprehensive analysis of the situation.
Okay, thank Thanks, Eva. Yeah, so the underfunding is a point, I think, which Sabina touched on at the beginning. And to Anastasia, you mentioned, well, we've talked about health organizations mostly, but there's also the patient. And we had a question came in from the audience on Article 18 of the GDPR, and in which specific conditions can an individual restrict the processing of data?
Right, that's a great question. First of all, just to clarify, because there may be there is a distinction between an objection and a restriction. A restriction essentially means that the data subject wishes to not process their personal data any further for any other purpose. So the only thing that's allowed in this case is just storage of data. And why is this article really used? Essentially, in this right, what is the component that is the most the biggest component? The first condition essentially is that when you don't agree with the accuracy of the data. So sometimes we might see that a patient disagrees with it's a fact, for example, like their type of blood, for example, is wrong, or a mistype happened on in the diagnosis or something like that. So the biggest cases of objections arise from a lack of accuracy of the data, and then the data subject would have the right to object the processing, restrict the processing by basically not allowing the organization to process any further. Also, restriction can occur when there is a law that does not allow that processing. So, for example, in Greece, I can say, because I am also becoming a Greek lawyer, there is the GDPR Implementation Act actually rejects any processing of genetic data unless you fall into a very, very specific category. So in this case, for example, it would be unlawful to process genetic data. And in that case, the data subject would be able to freely exercise this right. So it would be unconditional, of course, when it's unlawful in the state. So the restriction of data, of the personal data, the processing, is actually quite linked to the national laws. And other than that, you can also object when you believe that there is no legitimate interest in the organization to process your data, or when the data subject believes that the processing is no longer necessary for the purposes needed. So it's a bit you have to assess this right as a controller if you receive it, but you can find the conditions which apply in Article 18 in the subsections of Article 18.1.
Well, wonderful. Thank you, Anastasia. So what we'll do now is we'll start to close the webinar. We've had some excellent perspectives from different viewpoints on the topic of cybersecurity and privacy in the health domain. So I'd just like each of you to answer with a closing statement on. So it seems that, you know, the medical professionals are crying out for a system which will solve their problems, but maybe a greater awareness of cybersecurity issues and the various risks that are out there is needed. We've also heard that from the legal experts and cybersecurity experts are desperately trying to to address these issues. So, the question is, how do we achieve a culture shift in the health sector and in for cybersecurity and legal professionals? How do we achieve this culture shift if we're going to really address some of the problems which Sabina mentioned right at the beginning of the webinar, which could, you know, really take place? So I don't know who would. Maybe we should start with Sabina.
Well, a culture shift. A culture shift is also a generation shift, because, for example, young people are very experts in, let's say, information technology. For example, I don't have a Facebook page. I'm 60 years old. They are very expert, but at the same time, they are not secure in their behaviors. Older people are more secure because they're more scared and they're less compliant. So in a way, it's really a question of the security information and culture we have. If we have to do that when we go to work in a place, it's difficult. It's as though it has to be beforehand. When you go inside the hospital and you start working there, you have to have a friendly system that somehow it puts you in a condition to have a secure behavior, because the security culture comes before you go to work. That is my personal opinion.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sabina. Thank you very much. Yeah, generational shift is needed and will, I think, be natural as well. So let's ask the same question to Raniero.
Yeah, from my point of view, what is really important in healthcare, but also in other domains that are in the similar manner, is the create or the real place in the organization about the security IT or cybersecurity. That's can be an expansion of some security office that's already present, because in the similar manner of the IT operation IT that's have organization, people, and so role. Actually, the security is not considering a real office, and this kind of problems are also people that you need to perform the governance, but also to manage really well the security require a real change of mentality in terms of the organization, in sense that the security must be find a place inside of the organization structure and near to the top management level, and obviously this kind of the change of mentality require that the top management understand the real risks, and so starts to create the appropriate unit or division that's help to define how to perform the security in check and so forth. That's now in the healthcare is not definable, but also in other domain are not really well defined. And so this means a change and change means that change of the model of the organization that include the cybersecurity in terms of a real element of the organization. It's a must for the next future, in my opinion.
Excellent. Thank you, Raniero. So yeah, total major transformation of the way organizations are structured, not just in healthcare, but
yeah, in general speaking, okay, but in some domain already present, in the rest of the domain is not really defined, and that can create a really big issues to manage everything in terms of security.
Thank you, Raniero. So Anastasia, for you?
I'll try to keep it short to not keep our attendees for much longer, but following from the previous points, very important. Of course, the security, the best method would be to have a system that is 100% secure, but most of us are aware that that would not be possible. So probably the most short-term way to have a shift in this culture is a lot of training and raising awareness of these issues internally. So not only having a department, as Raniero just mentioned, whether within the organization or a new department that's created that would cover IT matters and legal issues, data protection issues, which are essential for for healthcare, because we are talking about possibly a life or death situation. So it needs to be ensured that there is a complete secure framework, but also that that employees and that the staff and the doctors are trained to know how to deal with these situations, because as we've learned how to write and how to read, we need to learn how to deal with technology from now on. And Sabina is the example of whether you're older or younger, you learn to adapt, and that's amazing to see. So it's already happening. We just need to take it to the next level.
Thank you, Anastasia. Very good point. So we have like a top-down approach from the management, but also more of a bottom-up awareness and understanding of the challenges. Okay. And finally, Eva, over to you for your closing statement.
Well, I can totally agree with the other speakers regarding the culture shift for younger generations, but also regarding the embedding of cybersecurity and data protection management within the organization. As I said earlier, funding is an issue, but it's also an issue is actually there's no lack of knowledge or material out there. So we have standards in IT security, we have concepts, and so there's really no lack of material, but many people do not know of these materials, or they are simply overwhelmed by the amount or by the lack of structure. So my hope would be that projects like Cyberwatching and Canvas, who collect all this material to prepare it and structure it a little bit for a wider audience, can also help in giving an overview what's there with regard to concepts and methodologies and ideas, solutions, approaches, and so forth.
Perfect. Thank you, Eva. Yeah, I think we've got 4 pieces of a very important puzzle. So basically people can be overwhelmed. So making sure that people have the right information at their hands, that it's clear what they have to do, and training people, of course, from bottom up, making sure the management structure kind of fosters these types of needs and makes them the rules, and then of course speaking to the professionals themselves to find out what they need and have that conversation. So with that, a little bit late, but thank you very much to all of you for staying on, and thank you very much to all 4 of our speakers for what was a very, very interesting webinar. We'll have all of the presentations online in the next hour. And this webinar has also been recorded so that you can download it or listen to it at a later date. So thank you very much for joining us. Please have a look at the results from the Canvas projects. Please register on the Cyberwatching project, register your project, and also please join us at the next webinar, which we are planning for the next month. Also, please have a look at PANACEA, as they are the ones who are really making this conversation happen between healthcare professionals and cybersecurity experts. So it's if you're following this field, then this project is very, very important in taking forward and addressing the needs which Sabina mentioned, and also the risk management issues, and introducing them into hospitals and so forth, how they address this. So you should watch this space. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a nice lunch.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for your attention.